I'm Grace. I'm 35. And 3 weeks ago, I arrested my own mother at her dining room table while documentary cameras filmed every second of the handcuffs clicking shut against the marble she bought with blood money I earned for her by smiling through third-degree burns. But that's the end, or the closest thing to an end I've found so far. To understand why I didn't scream when the flames took my father, why I didn't cry when they told me my twin brother was dead, why I spent 28 years being the poster child for grief that was never mine to sell, you have to understand the night I stopped being a child and became property. I was 7 years old. The house was a Victorian on the edge of town, the kind with wraparound porches and radiators that clanked like old bones. My father, Thomas, worked nights at the steel mill and smelled like coal and safety when he came home. My mother, Diane, smelled like hairspray and ambition. She had been a local news anchor before she married him, and she never let anyone forget that she had given up the camera for diapers and disappointment. Lucas was my twin, not identical, fraternal, but close enough that people sometimes confused us from behind. He had asthma, the kind that woke the house at 3 in the morning, the wheezing like a broken harmonica, the nebulizer humming its mechanical lullaby while my father rubbed his back and I fetched water from the kitchen tap. Lucas was soft. That was the word my mother used, though never to his face. Soft, sensitive, too much like your father, Grace, too little like me. I was the tough one. The one who fell off her bike and got back on before the blood reached her sock. The one who didn't cry at shots, at stitches, at the dentist's drill. My mother loved that about me. She called it her legacy. My father called it my armor. I didn't know then that armor was something you wore because someone else expected you to fight. The fire started in the walls. That's what the report said. Electrical fault, old wiring, a tragedy waiting in the bones of a beautiful house. I remember waking to the smell of smoke, not the romantic smell of fireplaces, but something chemical, wrong, like burning plastic and hair. I remember the orange light under my bedroom door. I remember Lucas wasn't in his bed. I remember running. Not to the window, not to the hall, to Lucas's room, because he couldn't run fast, because his inhaler was on his nightstand and his lungs were already half closed on good days. The door was hot. I opened it anyway. The handle branded a crescent into my palm that I still carry, a pale sickle-shaped scar that looks like a moon in reverse. The room was full of smoke, thick and gray and alive. I couldn't see him. I called his name. I crawled under the smoke because my father had taught me that, had made us practice after the factory had its own fire 2 years before. I found Lucas's bed empty. The sheets were thrown back. His inhaler was gone. I kept crawling. The heat was a wall. Then the window broke. Glass rained down like ice from a disturbed pond. I don't remember the pain, though the doctors later counted 47 shards in my back and arms. I remember the sound of my own voice, not screaming, chanting, Lucas, 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 like a prayer to a god who had already left the building. Hands pulled me out, neighbors, firefighters. Someone wrapped me in a blanket that smelled like gasoline and garden soil. I looked back at the house. The second floor was a mouth of orange and black chewing through the roof. My father was still inside. Lucas was still inside. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. Not because anyone told me, because the house had been my whole world, and suddenly it was missing 2 of its corners. They found my father's body in the hallway outside the master bedroom. The coroner said smoke inhalation. He had been trying to reach us, they said. The official story was that Lucas's asthma had overcome him in his sleep, that he never woke up, that by the time my father tried to save him, the flames had made the second floor a furnace. I was the miracle, the 7-year-old who crawled through hell to survive, the girl who wouldn't let go. My mother didn't cry at the funeral. She sat in the front pew in a black dress that fit her like a second skin, her makeup perfect, her hand in mine squeezing so hard I felt the bones in my fingers grind together. When the cameras came, and they came, local news, then regional, then national, she lifted my chin with her other hand and said, "Smile, Grace. Show them how brave you are." I smiled. My back was bandaged under my dress. My palm was wrapped in gauze that stuck to the burn with every movement. I smiled because my mother had never asked me to do anything else, and I was 7, and I thought that if I was brave enough, she might love me enough to fill the space where my father and my brother had been. Within a month, the Diane Hartwell Foundation was born. Its mission, to support child burn survivors and families affected by house fires. Its face, me. I was 8 when I gave my first speech at a Rotary Club luncheon. I was 9 when I cut the ribbon on the first burn recovery center, a facility my mother had leased with donations that poured in after my face appeared on morning shows. I was 10 when I learned to say resilience without stumbling, gratitude without choking, my mother is my hero without looking at my shoes. What nobody knew, what I barely admitted to myself, was that I didn't remember being brave. I remembered being terrified. I remembered crawling through smoke looking for a brother who wasn't in his bed. I remembered the empty sheets. I remembered the silence where Lucas's wheeze should have been. And I remembered, though I told no one, that the smoke had smelled wrong. Not like old wiring. Like something sweet and chemical, like the nail polish remover my mother used before her broadcasts, like the solvent my father used to clean his hands at the mill. But I was the miracle. I was the brand, and brands don't question their origin stories. My mother remolded our lives into a cathedral of grief. We moved into a new house, paid for by donors. She hired a publicist. She wrote a book, Asterisk from the Ashes, A Mother's Journey Asterisk, which I later learned she dictated to a ghostwriter over 3 weekends of spa treatments. I attended galas where men in tuxedos pressed checks into my mother's hand while telling me I was an inspiration. I posed for photos with other burn survivors, children whose scars were fresher than mine, whose eyes held the same hollow confusion I recognized in the mirror. I learned to hug them without wincing, to say it gets better without knowing if that was true, to let photographers position my scarred left arm just so, the light catching the shiny tissue, the visual shorthand for survival. I was 15 when I realized my mother had never once asked me what I remembered. Not about the fire, not about Lucas, not about my father. We had a therapist on retainer, Dr. Patricia Soren, a woman with a voice like warm honey who met with me twice a month and taught me breathing exercises and positive affirmations. But Dr. Soren's notes, which I found years later, filed in a cabinet my mother forgot to lock, were not about my healing. They were about my performance. Asterisk Grace remains emotionally labile regarding the loss of her brother. Recommend continued focus on gratitude narratives to prevent regression. Brand vulnerability high if she processes unresolved anger. Asterisk I was the product. And products don't get to be angry. I left home at 18, the earliest moment I could without triggering a media cycle my mother had prepared for. Runaway miracle. Where did we fail our brave girl? I chose a state college 3 hours away, paid for by a scholarship I earned by writing an essay I refused to let my mother edit. I studied fire science, not because I was noble, because I was obsessed. I needed to understand the thing that had taken my family. I needed to read its language, to know its appetite, to look it in the face and say, I see you, I know what you are, you don't get to be a mystery anymore. I became a fire investigator, one of the youngest in the state. I learned to read the aftermath the way a translator reads a dead language. Alligatoring, V-patterns, spalling, the color of smoke stains on drywall, the difference between a fire that started because electricity failed and a fire that started because someone wanted it to. I learned that fire is honest. It tells the truth about where it began, how fast it moved, what fed it. It was the first honest thing in my life. I met David at a training conference in Chicago. He was an arson prosecutor, sharp and kind, and patient in a way that made me suspicious at first. Patience, in my experience, was something people performed before they asked for something. But David didn't want anything except my stories, which I gave him slowly, like coins from a purse I was afraid to empty. We married when I was 26. Noah was born when I was 27, and for the first time I understood that love could be a quiet room, a hand on your back during a nightmare, a person who asked, "How are you?" and waited for an answer that wasn't a speech. Noah was 9 now. He had my father's eyes, dark and steady, and my mother's jaw, though I hoped he would use it for better things. He knew I had scars. He knew there had been a fire. He knew his grandmother was famous for helping people. He did not know that I dreaded every phone call from her, every invitation to a foundation event, every carefully timed hug for photographers that she orchestrated with the precision of a stage director. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. It started with a warehouse fire on the industrial side of town. 4 alarm, 2 injuries, total loss. I was called in because the insurance investigator suspected arson, and my lieutenant knew I had a reputation for finding what others missed. I walked through the ruins on a Tuesday morning, the smell of wet ash and chemical accelerant still hanging in the air like a ghost that hadn't been exorcised. The burn patterns were wrong. Multiple points of origin. low burns along the baseboards, indicating a liquid trail. And the smoke, when I interviewed the first responding firefighters, they mentioned a sweet chemical smell. Nail polish remover, solvent, the same smell I had buried under 28 years of therapy and positive affirmations. I pulled the file that night, not the warehouse file, my file, the original investigation into the fire at 442 Maple Street, March 15, 1998. I had never been allowed to see it as a child. My mother had told me it was too painful, that the details would traumatize me, that I needed to focus on the future. I had accepted this because I was trained to accept what Diane Hartwell said, but I was 35 now. I was a sworn investigator, and the case file was public record. I read it at my kitchen table while Noah slept upstairs and David worked late on a brief. The original investigator, a man named Frank DeLuca who had retired 5 years ago, had concluded electrical fault. Old wiring, a tragedy. His notes were sparse. No mention of accelerant. No mention of the multiple burn patterns I remembered, even as a child, even through smoke and terror. And then I found the insurance record. My mother had increased the homeowner's policy by 300% 3 months before the fire. She had added a rider for valuable personal effects that included jewelry she had purchased 2 weeks before the fire, jewelry that was never found and claimed as lost in the blaze. The payout was $847,000. The foundation started with a donation drive that raised another $2.3 million in the first year. My father had been planning to leave her. I found this in a letter my father's sister, Aunt Maureen, had written to the original investigator. It was in the file marked unsubstantiated rumor, never followed up. Thomas Hartwell had been seeing someone, a woman from the mill. He had told Maureen he was going to file for divorce, take the kids, expose Diane's spending and her charitable ambitions for what they were. Maureen had written the letter 2 weeks after the fire. DeLuca had interviewed Diane, who cried and said her sister-in-law was jealous and unstable. The note was buried. The case was closed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen and felt the old scars on my back ache with a phantom heat, the body's memory of betrayal. I pulled Lucas's autopsy report. It was brief, too brief. Remains consistent with smoke inhalation and thermal injury, positive identification by dental records. But I knew something the report didn't say. I knew Lucas hadn't been in his bed. I knew his inhaler was gone. And I knew because I had been there, because I had crawled through that room with my hands burning and my lungs screaming, that there had been no body. There had been no remains. There had been an empty bed and a window that broke before I could reach it. I called in favors. I used credentials I had spent 15 years earning. I accessed adoption records through a contact in the State Bureau, a woman named Carla who owed me from a case where my testimony had saved her pension. And there it was. A private adoption, finalized 6 weeks after the fire. A boy, 7 years old, asthmatic, placed with a family in Albany through a lawyer named Saul Crenwick, the same name I had found in Nora's story, because the world is small and the monsters reuse their tools. The birth mother was listed as Diane Hartwell. The father was listed as unknown. The fee was $50,000, paid from an account my mother had opened with the insurance payout. Lucas was alive. Lucas had been sold. Lucas had been breathing somewhere for 28 years while I posed for photos and gave speeches about resilience and smiled through pain that was only half mine. I found him in 3 days. Social media made it possible. Lucas Chen, his adoptive parents had given him their name, was a mechanic in a town 3 hours north. He had a daughter, Mia, who was 6. He had a wife who had left 2 years ago. He had my father's eyes in his profile picture, and he looked so much like me that I had to close my laptop and walk around the block 3 times before I could breathe again. I drove to Albany on a Saturday. David watched Noah. I didn't tell him where I was going because I couldn't say the words out loud yet. I found Lucas at a garage on the outskirts, working under a Honda Civic, his hands black with grease, his hair graying at the temples though he was only 35. I stood in the bay doorway and said his name. He slid out from under the car and looked at me, and he knew. I saw it in the way his face went slack, the way his eyes moved over my features, the way he reached for his inhaler in his pocket out of habit, the same way he had as a child. "I'm Grace," I said. "I'm your sister." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "I dream about a house burning. I dream about a woman who smells like hairspray, and I dream about a girl who crawls through smoke looking for me." He paused, his voice broke. I didn't know if you were real. We talked for 6 hours, in his small apartment above the garage, surrounded by Mia's drawings and the smell of motor oil and coffee. He remembered fragments. The nebulizer, my father's hands. The night Diane woke him and told him they were going on a trip, that Grace was already safe, that he needed to be brave for just a little longer. He remembered a house with yellow walls and a woman who fed him cereal. He remembered being told his old family had died, that he was lucky to have a new one, that he should forget. He had tried. He had built a life of forgetting, but the dreams never stopped. I showed him the files, the insurance records, the adoption receipt, the autopsy report that claimed he was dead while he was eating cereal in Albany. He read them with a concentration I recognized from my own hours in archives, the focus of someone who has spent their life trying to solve a puzzle they were told didn't exist. She burned the house, he said. It wasn't a question. She burned it to kill our father and to get rid of you, and to make me the miracle that would fund her life. He looked at his hands, grease in the creases, a mechanic's hands. What do? We tell the truth, I said, in front of everyone she's ever lied to. And we let the fire she started finally burn her. My mother was filming the final episode of a documentary series about the foundation. Asterisk Hartwell, 30 Years of Hope. Asterisk it was her magnum opus, a retrospective with tearful interviews, archival footage of me as a child, and a climactic scene where Diane and I would sit at her dining room table. Her new dining room table, imported marble, seats 12, and discuss the future of the legacy. She had invited me to give a speech. A farewell, she called it, passing the torch. I accepted. I brought Lucas. I brought Frank DeLuca, the retired investigator, who I had found living in a condo in Florida, drinking too much, carrying guilt he couldn't name until I showed him the file and he wept and said he knew. He always knew. But Diane had been so compelling, so tragic, so powerful. I brought Carla from the State Bureau. I brought a prosecutor named Stephen Vance who David had worked with and who owed my husband a favor. I brought the truth, wrapped in manila folders and USB drives, and the DNA test that proved Lucas and I were twins, that proved the boy in the autopsy report was a fiction. The night of the dinner, my mother had transformed her mansion into a set. Cameras in the corners, soft lighting, a sound technician who checked my lapel mic while telling me how much my story had meant to his sister. I wore a navy dress that covered my scars. Lucas sat in the kitchen, waiting for my signal, wearing a suit he had borrowed from his neighbor, his inhaler in his pocket, his hands shaking until I held them and said, "We do this together." Diane greeted me at the door with the same performance she had perfected over 3 decades. The moist eyes, the trembling smile, the hand on my cheek that was always just a little too hard. "Grace," she whispered. "My brave girl, my miracle, are you ready to share our story one last time?" I smiled. I had learned from the best. "I'm ready to tell the truth, Mom, for the first time." The dining room was full of donors, board members, the documentary crew. Candles everywhere. My mother loved candles, the irony so thick I could have choked on it. We sat at the marble table. The cameras rolled. Diane began her introduction, her voice carrying that particular lilt she used for climax, the one that made millionaires reach for their checkbooks. 30 years ago, she said, I lost everything, my husband, my son, but I had Grace, and from that ashes of that tragedy we built a light that has never gone out. I stood up. The room turned to me. I pulled a remote from my pocket, the kind that controls presentation slides, and clicked it. The screen behind Diane's head, which was supposed to show a montage of foundation highlights, went black. Then it showed the original fire report, the one I had found, the one DeLuca had buried, multiple points of origin, accelerant traces, the insurance policy tripled dated 3 months before the fire. The room went silent. Diane laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Grace, what is this, some kind of joke?" "It's the truth," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced steadiness my entire life. "You didn't lose Lucas in the fire, Mom. You sold him to Saul Krenwick for $50,000. Here is the receipt." I clicked again. The adoption record appeared, the bank transfer, the date, 6 weeks after the fire. Diane's face went white. She stood up, her chair scraping the marble. "This is insane. Grace, you've been under so much stress. The foundation was a laundering operation for blood money," I said. "You killed Dad because he was leaving you. You got rid of Lucas because he was soft, because he was work, because he didn't photograph well. And you made me the mascot, the scarred little miracle who smiled for cameras while you bought marble tables and spa memberships and a life built on our father's ashes." I walked to the kitchen door and opened it. Lucas stepped into the dining room. The cameras caught him. The donors gasped. He looked exactly like me, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same way of standing too straight when we were afraid. He walked to my side and took my hand. "Hello, Mom," he said. His voice was quiet, it didn't need to be loud. The room was already holding its breath. "You told me my family died, you told me to forget, but I remember Grace. I remember her voice in the smoke, I remember she was looking for me." Diane collapsed back into her chair, not from grief, from calculation. She was already trying to find the angle, the spin, the way to make this about my instability, about Lucas's confusion, about the stress of a family tragedy that had warped our memories. But Frank DeLuca stood up from the corner where he had been sitting, unrecognized, an old man in a borrowed suit. "I was the investigator," he said. "And I was wrong, or I was made wrong. She paid me to close the case, not cash, just access, invitations, a seat on the board. I took it, and I've been burning ever since." Then Carla stood up, then Stephen Vance. They didn't say anything, they just walked to the table and placed their credentials on the marble. Vance looked at Diane and said, "Diane Hartwell, you are under arrest for insurance fraud, arson resulting in death, kidnapping by deception, and the murder of Thomas Hartwell. You have the right to remain silent." The cameras kept rolling. My mother looked at me, and for the first time in 35 years, I saw her without her mask. Not a monster, not a devil, just a woman who had chosen herself at every fork in the road, who had looked at her children and seen only leverage, who had confused love with audience share. She didn't say she was sorry. She said, "How could you do this to me, after everything I built for us?" I looked at Lucas. I looked at the scars on my hand, the crescent moon branded into my palm. "You didn't build anything for us," I said. "You built it on us, and I'm done being your foundation." They led her out in handcuffs. The donors sat in shock, some crying, some already reaching for their phones to divest, to distance, to delete their association. The documentary crew filmed until Vance told them to stop. I didn't watch her leave. I turned to Lucas, and I put my arms around him, and I felt him shake against me, the same way he had shaken during asthma attacks when we were 7, the same way I had shaken in burning hallways, looking for a brother who had been stolen from me while I was still crawling. I closed the foundation the next week. We liquidated the assets and transferred the remaining $4.2 million to a real burn center in the city, one that didn't have my face on its brochures. I met with the families who had donated over the years, the ones who had written letters to me, the little girls who had sent drawings of my scars as wings. I told them the truth. Some were angry, some were relieved. All of them deserved to know that their compassion had been hijacked by a woman who thought grief was a renewable resource. Lucas moved to my town 3 months later, not too close, not too far. An apartment 20 minutes away where Mia could play with Noah, where we could have dinner on Sundays and not fill the silences with performance. We were awkward together. We didn't have a language for twins who had missed 30 years. We argued about music and politics and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. But we were real. And we were choosing each other day by day, without cameras, without speeches, without a mother scripting our grief. Last week, Noah came into my bedroom at midnight. He had had a nightmare. I held him the way my father had held Lucas, rubbing his back, humming tunelessly, and I started to cry. Not the silent tears I had perfected for stages and cameras. Real sobs, ugly and loud, the kind that shake your ribs and make your nose run. Noah pulled back and looked at me alarmed. "Mom," I wiped my face. I laughed, though it sounded broken. "I'm okay, baby, I'm finally sad, for the little girl who wasn't allowed to be." He thought about this. Then he put his arms back around my neck and held on. "You can be sad now," he whispered. "I'll be brave for you." I wept until my throat was raw. For my father, who tried to save us. For Lucas, who grew up without knowing he had a sister who never stopped looking. For the 7-year-old girl who crawled through smoke and was told to smile for the camera instead of screaming for justice. And for myself, at 35, finally learning that the strongest thing I could do was not survive beautifully. It was to fall apart in front of people who loved me anyway. That's my story. If someone ever made you a mascot for your own pain, if someone sold your truth to buy their throne, if someone told you that being strong meant being silent, hear me. You are not their foundation. You are not their brand. You are not the ashes they get to build their temple on. You are the fire, and you get to decide what burns.